Everybody, welcome. It's just about 3:30. It's wonderful to see all of you here in the room. It's a great crowd. And also, I know we have a wonderful crowd on Zoom. So welcome to everybody to American University Washington College of Law. Thank you for joining us. We have a wonderful program today. My name is Asha Shelzo, and I have the real privilege of serving as the director of the Health Law and Policy program here at AUWCL. We are joined by Maya Mannion, who is our faculty director, and many of our faculty and alumni are here as well as, of course, our fantastic students. And you're going to get to hear a little bit more about our student leaders in a moment. We are very pleased to have you joining our program today, which is presented by the Health Law and Policy Brief, Revolutionizing Drug Development and Regulation, the Impact of AI in Pharmaceuticals. And this is actually quite a broad topic. So you're going to see that we're going to be tackling this from some different perspectives. We're going to be looking at how AI is transforming drug development, but also the legal frameworks guiding it, as well as how we think about regulating and the oversight of these programs. We're going to be looking at legal, ethical, and policy challenges. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are live captioning this event over Zoom for those who would like to use that resource. You can find that on your Zoom screen. And I also want to mention that we are recording this program. And so you're going to be able to find it on our YouTube page very soon, along with all of our other programs from this year and past years. So we have a couple of thank yous that I want to do. You've had a chance, I think, to hopefully to enjoy the coffee and cookies. You're going to have a wonderful reception today at 5 p.m. with lots of delicious food. We want to thank our catering for that, of course, our AV to help all the technology setup, facilities, and many others here at AU, including our special events team. We know that all of your support makes these events happen so smoothly and effectively. I also want to thank our Health Law and Policy Program coordinator, Tamina Asif, who's right here in the front. She's literally the backbone of our program, and she is the one who has really made a lot of magic happen here for today's event. Now, most importantly, we have some fantastic student leaders. As I mentioned, this program is presented by our Health Law and Policy Brief as part of their annual symposium event. I'd like to introduce you to our symposium director, Sarah Elliott, and our editor-in-chief, Tiana Robinson. And they have both been exceptionally thoughtful in putting together today's program, even thinking about what the topic is going to be and how we should scope it, who the wonderful panelists and moderator are going to be, how we should think about planning for the event, start to finish. They have been hands-on. They're dedicated, they're passionate students, and there are, again, many others of you who are here with the brief who've been working behind the scenes for the success of this event. So just kudos to all of the student leaders, including Tiana and Sarah, who stepped up. So I'm going to really turn things over to them. This is their program. This is their moment to really demonstrate to you their exceptional leadership and passion. And again, I really hope we enjoy this time together. A quick thank you that I know they will also echo to our wonderful moderator, Professor Grossman, who is here, as well as our wonderful panelists. And you're going to get to hear more about them and more from them, of course, for the next 90 minutes. Do remember to stay till 5 o'clock for the reception. All right. See you all very soon. Turning it over to you guys. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tiana Robinson, and I am the editor-in-chief of the American University Washington College of Law Health Law and Policy Brief. The brief is a student-run publication dedicated to examining emerging issues in health law and policy. Founded in 2007, we published 2 issues annually and maintained a blog covering a wide range of health law and policy topics. Our mission is to provide a platform for legal scholarship and foster meaningful discussion on the legal and policy issues reshaping this field. As law students, we engage with these topics both in and out of the classroom, questioning, debating, searching for solutions, but no single perspective is enough. This is why conversations like today's, which brings together experts from diverse backgrounds, are so valuable. They broaden our perspectives and help connect law, policy, and practice in ways that we cannot do alone. On behalf of the brief, I want to thank our panelists for sharing their insights and everyone here for being a part of this important conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Hello, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to our panelists, of course. When Tiana and I first started brainstorming ideas for this topic, the idea came up almost immediately, and I remember both of our faces lighting up. It felt timely, fast, and incredibly relevant to where health law and pharmaceutical regulation are heading. AI is no longer theoretical in this space. It is actively shaping how drugs are developed, how regulators review products and how companies navigate compliance and innovation. This topic is also personally meaningful for me. It was inspired by my first blog post I wrote for the Health Law and Policy Brief, My Fall of One Owl, which explored emerging regulatory questions around AI and drug development. Being able to bring that full circle and turn it into a full symposium conversation is really exciting. Today's panel is structured to move across perspectives. Each speaker will begin with brief remarks from their vantage point, and then we will move into a moderated discussion focused on transparency, data governance, bias, and broader legal and policy challenges these tools raise. We will close with time for audience questions. I want to thank our distinguished panelists today for sharing their expertise with us. Now I'm pleased to introduce the moderator, Louis Grossman. Professor Louis Grossman writes, teaches, and speaks about food and drug law, health law, American legal history, and civil procedure. His book, Choose Your Medicine, Freedom of Therapeutic Choice in America, was published by Oxford University Press in the fall of 2021. He is the co-author of the 5th edition of Food and Drug Law, Cases and Material. He publishes widely in both law journals and medical journals. Professor Grossman has served on 5 committees of the National Academy's Health and Medicine divisions. He has also been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and Cornell Law School. Thank you, Professor Grossman.
Thank you all for being here, and it's a real privilege to moderate this panel that brings in such diverse perspectives in terms of career experiences and even educational experiences. I'm going to very briefly introduce the panelists because the details of their bios are available on the handout. But just very quickly, next to me is Elaine Lippman, who is a principal at Levitt Partners, a healthcare and government affairs consulting firm downtown. Most recently, she left FDA, where she had 15 years of leadership experience and a senior role within FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, where she advised agency leadership on drug policy development and regulatory strategy. Next, we have Nicole Mahoney, who's the executive director of U.S. Regulatory Policy and Intelligence at the company Novartis. She serves as the executive director for U.S. Regulatory and Policy at the company and leads global regulatory policy efforts related to data and digital technologies, including AI and real-world evidence. And she holds a doctorate in biochemistry, so she's one of the truly smart people, unlike us lawyers. Then we have Vanessa Burrows, who's a partner at the law firm of Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett, and importantly, a WCL graduate. She advises pharmaceutical, medical device, healthcare, and technology companies on FDA regulatory compliance and enforcement matters. And what I think she's really going to bring to this panel is another approach, which is that she counsels clients in connection with major transactions. And I often tell my students that FDA law is not just regulatory law, it's also corporate law, transactional law, litigation, and Vanessa's career reflects that. Before that, she worked at the Congressional Research Service. And then finally, my friend Anjali Deshmukh, who is an assistant professor of law at Seton Hall University School of Law, where she recently moved after several very stellar years at Georgia State Law School. In addition to being a brilliant lawyer and scholar, she is also a board-certified pediatrician who maintains an active practice in pediatrics. And so she's another one of the really smart ones. So I'm going to turn it over to Elaine, who's going to start us off with her presentation.
Great, thank you for that introduction. Let's make sure the slides advance.
Sometimes you have to click it
Twice. We'll try to reset it. Here we go.
Oh.
There we go. Okay. So
AI is being used in a vast array of contexts in medical product regulation, both by industry and by FDA. I'm going to focus in my remarks on the use of AI by FDA in its regulatory decision-making, while my fellow panelists are going to speak more about the industry and developer side. So as was said in the intro, I'm currently, let's stay there for a second. I'm currently a principal at Levitt Partners, but until recently, I was a policy advisor at FDA for a long time. So I'm a lawyer by training, but served in a policy role. And that's really the lens through which I approach these issues. Now, in the context of AI, policy work is really focused on helping FDA achieve its mission and come to the appropriate science-based outcomes by ensuring that AI is used with the proper consideration of issues like transparency, accountability, reliability. These important policy issues really need to be addressed in order for AI to be effective in helping FDA with its pharmaceutical regulation. So the core question I really want to pose is, what happens to things like transparency, due process, and intellectual property when regulatory decisions are informed either partly or heavily by AI? Now, to be clear, there are many interesting policy issues implicated with AI, but I'm going to focus on these three. Now, before diving into the legal issues, I want to level set about what we mean by AI. I think it helps to think of AI tools as being along a spectrum, because the legal and policy issues really depend greatly on where we are on that spectrum. So first, we have traditional algorithms, which are just systems that are programmed to follow fixed rules. So there's nothing autonomous about these tools. They don't learn. They're programmed if X, then Y. Then you have machine learning, which is where algorithms learn from data to make predictions or decisions without explicit programming. Then you've got agentic AI, which is systems that use machine learning, plus they have goals, memory, tools, and the ability to take actions autonomously. So the key difference in these is the level of autonomy, right? As AI moves along the spectrum, the policy stakes rise, because the more autonomous the AI tool gets, the more it may appear to be substituting for human judgment. So now getting into the policy issues. First, let's talk about transparency and the administrative record. So as you, of course, all know, under traditional administrative law, agencies must be able to explain the basis for their decisions and build an administrative record that supports judicial review. This all sounds familiar, right? So the big question is, how much must FDA explain about its AI use for its decisions to be lawful and legitimate? Now, if FDA uses just a traditional algorithm, for example, let's say to flag outlier clinical trial results, transparency concerns are relatively modest. The agency can describe what the algorithm does, what inputs it uses, and how the output affected the solution or the decision. So this really fits comfortably within the existing doctrine that we already know. As AI becomes more complex, transparency becomes harder. Machine learning models may be difficult even for FDA staff to be able to explain fully. When FDA uses something like machine learning, the agency typically understands what the model is designed to do and how it performs overall, but not always why it reached a particular output in a particular case. The model's output reflects the combined influence of a whole bunch of weighted factors. It doesn't have a clear checklist. So at high levels of autonomy, traditional transparency frameworks start to strain. Some of the key policy questions then are things like, should FDA be required to disclose the model architecture, training data, or validation results? Is it enough to explain the outcome, or must FDA explain the reasoning process behind the AI? Also, how do you define the record if the AI system changes between runs? So next, let's talk a little bit about intellectual property and confidentiality. So FDA decisions rely really heavily on confidential commercial information. And that's because, FDA is constantly receiving submissions from companies with tons of proprietary data, right? Clinical trial data and that sort of thing. So AI can really complicate this in a couple of ways. One is training data. Can FDA train models on proprietary submissions? Does that constitute a new use of the data? And then there's disclosure obligations. If transparency requires explaining how the AI works, does that risk exposing trade secrets, either of the FDA vendors that are working the AI or the regulated companies? And again, thinking about that spectrum, as AI becomes more autonomous, FDA may rely more on vendor-developed models. Vendors might assert IP protections over the model details, while companies might argue that they can't challenge decisions without having the details to be privy to those details. So this really sets up a three-way tension between agency accountability, private IP rights, and regulated parties' procedural protections. Then finally, we have due process and the ability to challenge decisions. So due process in this context, of course, isn't about constitutional hearings. It's about just basic fairness, notice of the basis for the decision, and having a meaningful opportunity to respond. Again, thinking about the spectrum of AI, if AI is one output among many, companies can dispute the underlying data. They can argue that FDA misinterpreted or over-relied on the AI output. That's relatively straightforward, and courts already know how to handle that kind of a challenge, right? But problems arise with higher autonomy AI if, for example, FDA can't explain why the AI reached a particular conclusion, or the AI identifies risks or deficiencies that humans didn't independently evaluate. So this raises some uncomfortable questions. How do you cross-examine an algorithm? What does it mean to show that a decision was arbitrary and capricious if no human made the critical judgment? Does reliance on opaque AI effectively insulate FDA decisions from judicial review? So the question isn't whether FDA should use AI. It already is, I promise. The question is how to preserve transparency, fairness, accountability when the decision maker is no longer entirely human. Are the existing laws and regulatory frameworks sufficient, or are new guardrails needed? And I want to acknowledge here that I have spent the last 10 minutes posing a lot of questions and not answering any of them. All of this is not a technical challenge, it's a legal one. So you guys need to hurry up and graduate and get out there and solve some of these challenges. So I will stop there and turn it over.
Thank you very much. And just to make clear, when we're talking about FDA decision-making on this panel today, what we're primarily discussing is FDA review of drug applications, right? Because there's all other kinds of things that FDA could be using AI for. But
sure.
Yeah.
Prioritizing inspection sites. I mean, it's not just review of applications, but that would be a classic example.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nicole.
Thanks a lot. I'm Nicole Mahoney. I'm in the Global Regulatory Policy team at Novartis, as was mentioned. And just so you understand the vantage point that I'm going to take, I want to give you an insight into my day-to-day activities. So as a policy person, one of the things working on AI, one of the things I do is I help internal teams try to navigate the policy landscape. And that's really important, especially in this gray zone where we don't have a lot of precedent and we don't really know what type of evidence FDA or other regulators might actually expect in order to show that they can rely on our evidence to show that to make a decision on a drug about its safety or effectiveness or who it should be administered to. So that's one thing I do. The other thing is when you do have this gray area or a gap in what the policy is, there's an opportunity to shape it. So we work with external stakeholders, including other companies, vendors who make these AI tools, and also regulators, not only in the US, but in the EU and other countries as well, to try to shape what the future regulatory environment might look like. So that's the vantage point that I'm coming at this with. I also work on some of the issues that Elaine mentioned, but and I find those fascinating. But I'm going to talk about how we think about our products and how we try to deploy AI across the life cycle of medicines, and then what kind of expectations are regulators putting on us, and how will we navigate that? So that's the vantage point. And with that, I'll just let you know that industry, including Novartis, is using AI for a variety of reasons right now. I would say we're still in the early days, but just as recently as last week, FDA mentioned that last year alone, they received about 500 applications across drug and biologics products where companies were using AI. Most of those are in the investigational phase. They're not really at the decision-making phase for an approval, but that gives you a sense of the increase in the use of AI over time. And we use it all across the spectrum. So one area is with discovery. So discovering new compounds that may eventually become drugs and discovering new disease targets. As you move closer to patients in clinical trials, we do non-clinical studies where we do modeling for safety and toxicology. And that you have to do before you even consider putting a drug into a human clinical trial. We also do a lot of animal studies, and what the hope is that AI can help us reduce our reliance on animals moving forward. I hope that comes to fruition. Moving on to clinical studies, there are a number of different reasons why we might use or try to use AI to improve the efficiency or just the quality of some of our clinical studies. That could be in figuring out an outcome, like doing more reliable assessments of an outcome for a patient. So maybe tumor shrinkage. Maybe now we have physicians who actually look at scans, like a CT scan, for patients. In the future, maybe that will be even more and more automated by AI, and we'll have more objective readings of how a treatment is working. So that's an example of how we might use it. Another place that we might use it, and actually Novartis is starting to, is for pharmacovigilance and looking at the safety of products once they're on the market. So we actually have a tool that we've talked about publicly that helps screen our social media accounts. So when patients are saying something about our products, we can look and see if anyone might be having an adverse event. And it's really helpful to use AI because we get thousands and thousands of these social media posts. A tiny sliver of them may have a hint of a safety issue, and it just helps us with processing all of that information. And we have to do that for compliance. And then finally, in manufacturing, we're trying to deploy AI across industry to refine our manufacturing. So just want to give you a flavor of all the ways that it's being used. When it comes to regulations, regulators really have oversight in the three boxes on the right. That's where they have authority, and that's where they're looking to have oversight of us and our what we're doing. And then I also want to let you know that at the bottom, I have an arrow about business efficiencies and operations. Just like every other business, we're using AI for efficiency, to manage documents, to manage knowledge, to generate first drafts of regulatory submissions, protocols for trials, and then even to help us speed our process for answering health authority questions. So that's the kind of uses that are in play that we're talking about. Oh, that should have come first. My legal disclaimer.
Not valid.
I felt obliged to put that in here. So what do I do when a team comes to me, and they do, and they ask, what do I need to consider? I want to use AI in this process as part of drug development. What do I have to think about? And from a regulatory perspective, there are other legal perspectives they have to think about, but I'm just thinking right now about regulatory. And I'll just give you a hint of where I would tell them to get started and be sure that there's much more they have to consider. So the first place I might say to look is something that's brand new. It came out a month ago, and these are joint principles for good machine learning and AI that were issued by FDA and EMA together. And it gives 10
Tell us what the EMA is.
Oh, I'm sorry, the European Medicines
Control C.
Agency. I was going to say association. It's agency. And these are just 10 principles for good practice of AI. So they include common sense things like have multidisciplinary expertise at the table. That would include legal, that would include ethics, that would include statisticians. And then other things like think about risk and think about risk management for whatever process you want to use AI for. And so this would be a first place to start. I would then kind of talk to them about how to get deeper in the weeds on all of those parameters that I just mentioned. And one place to look is new FDA draft guidance on using AI in drug development. This kind of fleshes out a lot of the concepts that are in the good machine learning principles. And this document, in case you want to look at it, is a risk-based approach to AI oversight. This is how the regulators are going to evaluate our products based on the evidence that we give them. And it applies to regulatory decision-making that involves patient safety or the effectiveness or quality of our products. It's a 7-step process, and it's a really overarching framework that's very helpful for teams. Importantly, one thing I remind people, and the guidance does too, all of the past approaches and guidance for drug development still applies to AI. This guidance is just meant to cover the unique gaps that AI brings to the table. And Elaine mentioned them. It's one of them that's obvious. We might not always know how an AI model is coming to a conclusion or producing a piece of evidence. We might not know that logic. So what can we do to show that we can still trust it? That's what this guidance helps you with. And it's also agnostic to the type of AI model. So some of the more complex, continuously learning models should be covered by this guidance. So just to leave you with a sense of the open questions, because I'm going to also bring up some questions that I want to answer. Right now, we're in a situation where we have some guidance that applies to really any case we're using AI, but it's not really tailored. Eventually, we want to get to the right-hand side of this arrow, where we have more tailored understanding of what's required for different uses. But to get there, we have to address regulatory and process questions, and also scientific and technical. A lot of those are legal. So for example, data access or access to understand a vendor's architecture for their AI model is something where you need contract law. We need to really ask for it. And so here are some questions I'll leave you with. One is, what does transparency mean for different stakeholders? I'm thinking about, what does transparency mean for FDA reviewers? The other thing is kind of in response to what Elaine presented. Should regulators be using these good machine learning practices? I would argue probably that and more. And then are we going to have to redo our regulatory frameworks to accommodate continuously learning systems?
Thank you. Vanessa.
Thanks, Nicole. So the way that AI in drug development will come up in my practice in a day-to-day basis in transactions is usually through diligence in the M&A, like mergers and acquisitions process. So if one client is buying another client, assessing how that client has been using AI in drug development or otherwise, do they have the right governance and procedures in place? What have they been doing? Have they had any intellectual property issues with how they've built their internal systems? And then translating that into reps and warranties in a merger agreement or otherwise to say, that they have, made these particular representations about how they have been using AI throughout the drug development process and how they've been interacting with regulators. And then the other way it comes up is in the capital markets side of my practice, which is for those of you who are familiar with an initial public offering,
That's a document that would be filed with the SEC as a registration statement if someone wants to go public. So a lot of biotechs and other small pharma companies would go public to help raise capital for furthering drug development. And in those documents, they have to disclose what are material risks to the company. And it used to be that there was not a standalone AI risk factor, but now there are more and more AI risk factors in SEC filings, and they have to really adequately describe all of the particular risks, some of which are not particular to drug development, but others with the use of AI could be particular to drug development. So you might have a general AI risk factor, but also very specific ones with respect to FDA and EMA processes as well. So that's just kind of an overview of how it comes into play day to day for me. I thought it might be interesting to see how, as Nicole and Elaine mentioned, how FDA is actually using AI with respect to animal studies. So going to the preclinical part of drug development, oftentimes you have dogs, monkeys, et cetera, that are used to test new drugs, make sure that they're safe in humans before they can be entered into investigational new drug trials on humans. And FDA has really come up with a number of systems to replace animals or to kind of have twins of animal models to assess the safety and efficacy risks or think about dosage and other considerations. So for example, these programs on the screen are all for toxicology, which is measuring or analyzing how chemical substances are affecting the body. So they're intended to support and strengthen FDA's safety review processes for drugs and biologics. As you might expect, these animal studies are crucial. So FDA is using these new approaches to generate toxicology data. The animal GAN one, for example, on the slide, it uses testing data from animal models to evaluate the safety of chemicals. And then it also supplements animal studies by screening new and untested chemicals to refine and substitute for animal experiments. So I thought it's just fascinating. These programs have been in place for a long time. Some of them and others are being used to do product reviews and submissions that are before FDA, but really a great example of how FDA is incorporating this into practice. Then on the next slide, Nicole already kind of touched on some of the FDA guidance documents and other discussion and notices that FDA has put out. But dating back to 2019 or maybe even earlier, FDA has been putting out a number of white papers, not at the level of a final draft guidance in most cases, but a number of ways that they're thinking about AI in drug development and really extensively in the medical device space, which we won't touch on today. One I wanted to flag is just how all of the FDA thoughts about ways that AI can be used in drug development. So in its May 2023 discussion paper, which touches on using AI and machine learning in the development of drugs and biological products, FDA thinks about drug discovery as well as pharmaceutical manufacturing in an advanced capacity, which would be process controls and making manufacturing lines more efficient. So detecting before a product would get to market or get into a patient that there is some, defect in this product or there's some, impurity. And so we should pull that line. We should, use AI in determining whether a lot should be released for further processing, which obviously has great implications for everyone because it means that the drugs that do come to market will be safer. There might be less recalls, et cetera. And then, as Nicole mentioned, there's post-market safety surveillance. So detecting and preventing and otherwise addressing adverse events, not just that come in to the drug manufacturers and social media accounts, but that might appear in clinical records or hospital records or otherwise. And then there's another March 2023 AI discussion paper that FDA had released on drug manufacturing, which also covers more advanced manufacturing applications. When a drug is first being tested in clinical trials, it might be small batches of the drug that are being made, but then as you get into later phases of clinical trials for a drug or biologic, you're scaling up your manufacturing processes, which introduces new risks. So AI is, able to help in those capacities, maybe having additional sensors or monitoring, looking at trends that otherwise might be more cumbersome to determine. And this slide just is one graphic. It's probably too small for some of you to read in the audience, but hopefully those online can see it. But it is in the guidance document itself. And
It's just providing an overview of AI technology and the different steps and how it can be used to improve manufacturing of drugs and biologics. But FDA has obviously concerns, as Elaine and Nicole both mentioned, about access to data. And that is, probably true in pharmaceutical manufacturing as well. Access to the records, determining, how the data practices are being managed, as well as clarity about the applications of AI in manufacturing and how they should be subject to regulatory oversight. As Nicole mentioned, all of the continual manufacturing processes that FDA currently has, the CGMP, are in place and won't go away. They're just being modified by AI, and AI introduces new risks with respect to good manufacturing practices. And of course, one of the biggest areas of concern would be any AI model that's being continually adaptive and learning, because if it's learning in a way that is not beneficial or learning incorrectly, then it might pose additional risks that weren't in an earlier version of the AI model, for example. So as I mentioned, in the capital market side of my practice, I spend a lot of time thinking about legal risks and how companies should describe legal risks. So this slide kind of combines a whole bunch of different risks from different SEC filings into different buckets. And it's really, different how companies describe it. And even established companies that do their annual filings would have risks about AI in them. One of the most common ways the companies think about risks is how AI is exacerbating potential risks that are already in place, such as data privacy or cybersecurity or intellectual property risks. Because you could have, if FDA were to get hacked or the vendor were to get hacked, and you have your IP that's been incorporated into someone else's technology, then now you're at risk of losing your competitive advantage. So that's obviously always one of the top risks. And I'm not an IP lawyer, but it's very important from an IP perspective. And then governance and developing responsible uses of AI. Obviously making sure that there's no new safety risks that are being introduced. And then, the potential for new compliance costs with AI and new regulations that, we haven't seen a ton of new laws in this exact space. There's been a lot of new state laws that I'll mention in another slide or two, focused on kind of consumer protection, but not necessarily aimed at drug manufacturers. In terms of how consumers should be protected from AI uses in the clinical healthcare provider practices. So one thing I did want to mention, and that will transition to Anjali's presentation, is about data privacy and cybersecurity. So there's a lot of patient information that would be collected through the clinical trial process that would be very valuable. And it's not always covered by HIPAA, which is because the individuals who are collecting the patient information are not necessarily a healthcare provider that would be covered by HIPAA. So thinking about that human subject data in clinical trials and how valuable it could be, and that maybe genetic or other information that's associated with that is a big risk. And thinking about how that human subject data can be used to train AI models going forward is also very unique, and maybe an area that isn't covered by all sorts of current federal laws and regulations that are focused on health privacy. So for HIPAA, as you might know, it applies to healthcare providers, health plans, and healthcare clearinghouses, but it wouldn't necessarily apply to a pharmaceutical manufacturer unless the pharmaceutical manufacturer or biologics manufacturer was acting as a healthcare provider. Let's say there was a specific gene therapy, and so that patient was getting, that gene therapy through the drug company, and the drug company was employing the physicians, and the insurance was paying them or something. But it would be rare for a pharmaceutical company to be a covered entity unless they were, let's say, also doing telehealth or something else that would bring them under HIPAA. But the entities that are covered by HIPAA, their data is, of course, very valuable to pharmaceutical manufacturers and others, and that data, health data, can be used to train AI. So companies need to think about too, like, how can we use this patient data, human subject data, and other data to train AI and making sure that if you are covered by HIPAA, you have the right agreements in place to ensure that the data is flowing in the way that is legally permissible when it can be used to train AI. And a lot of companies would have considerations about de-identification of data that could be then used to train AI. But let's say your data is not being used to train AI appropriately, that the vendor or whatever that got the data to start with obtained it in a way that wasn't, obtained through patient consent, or the right contractual protections weren't in place. And then now you've built this AI into your system or use that data to train your AI. There are remedies, let's say that the Federal Trade Commission could enact and has enacted, not necessarily against drug manufacturers, but against others that have trained algorithms on data without patient consent or without the appropriate protections. And that can include the destruction of your algorithm, the destruction of your data sets, and a failure to be able to market that data and that information. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're using patient-protected health information to train AI and for machine learning. Lastly, I'll just touch briefly on state AI laws. These laws are, as I said, are not really aimed at drug manufacturers or drug development. It's more consumer focused at this time and putting consumer protections in place. But to the extent that a drug manufacturer or drug developer were to market their services to the public, or let's say there's a direct-to-consumer platform that's being used by a drug manufacturer and consumers are obtaining that drug through telehealth that's offered by the drug manufacturer, then if there's AI being involved in that conversation, you could have disclosure obligations under state laws about how the patient data is being used. And you need to think about, making sure that the public is aware of the data set and what it's being used for and how their data is intended to in terms of the purpose of the system and otherwise. So I think I'll just leave it with this bias iceberg, and we'll touch a little bit more on health equity in a minute. But obviously, the data that goes into training AI for pharmaceutical development and manufacturing and other purposes is very important, and we need to be aware, of course, of any kind of systemic and other biases that might be present as the AI systems are being built. So this NIST iceberg, I think, is a great job of capturing that concept.
Right. Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here. And these women have provided some really wonderful insights. They're quite a tough act to follow. So I was tasked with bringing this conversation to a different level of granularity, thinking a little bit about ethical challenges from a patient-focused perspective. As Lewis mentioned, in addition to teaching about AI in medicine at Seton Hall, I'm a pediatrician. I'm on the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Drugs. And my disclosures up front, these remarks are my own and do not represent the views of my employer or any organization that I'm part of. I'm talking a lot and thinking a lot how data is used to train models going forward, as Vanessa mentioned. And if I have to sum this up in one sentence, the devil's in the details. Some reports suggest 70% of drug companies are using AI in drug discovery right now. And there's not one uniform system. So the granularity and the details of each AI model really matter as we try to approach how do we regulate this? How do we make sure this is continuing in an ethical fashion? And I want to just start by recognizing and commending the tremendous amount of work that's gone into FDA's approach to regulating AI to date. To set broad principles and create a flexible model-specific framework for regulating such a complex, evolving ecosystem is a challenge. But I also want to critique it a little bit. My main critique is that the FDA's drug development plan, as it stands, fails to consider some of the patient-specific legal and ethical dimensions of AI use in drug discovery. I personally advocate that medical AI models should be patient-centered and with due consideration for ethical challenges when used with specific patient populations, along with the model-specific credibility risks that the FDA is putting forward. And I'm hoping to translate all of that and help you guys understand the need for model and population-specific ethical guidance using the example of pediatric digital twins. Now, the previous speakers have highlighted really amazing efforts by national organizations and international governments to create frameworks to ensure that AI adheres to ethical standards. Broadly speaking, there's 4 pillars of ethical frameworks for AI: transparency, fairness, privacy and security, and accountability. I personally think we might need a couple more pillars.
Yeah.
So AI can take a lot of different forms. So I'm going to try to be very precise and give you a very granular example. Drug discovery is, as you've learned, historically an iterative process, and it occurs in at least 4 main stages. You start with target discovery, lead identification, lead expansion, and then optimization. And when we normally think about drug discovery, lead expansion and optimization are what we're usually talking about. These extensive cycles to optimize the chemical structure, and then biological testing, and then studying the structure-activity relationship to then find a lead compound and then get that lead compound into being a prospective drug candidate. And AI tools can be integrated into all of these stages of drug discovery to speed up the processes. Vanessa and the rest of the panel has really eloquently explained. But I want to focus on the last piece, optimization. And to really understand the problem, I want to get even more narrow to a specific piece of optimization: pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. For a clinician, it's really important to understand how drugs move through the body. And that's reflected in FDA's requirement that companies have to understand how drugs are absorbed, how they're distributed, how they're metabolized, excreted, and the toxicology properties of new molecular entities. Now, historically, that was done through experimental approaches, but that has a lot of shortcomings. It's time-consuming, it's expensive, and it involves animal welfare issues, as we've heard about. And that's been spurring the emergence of another form of testing, the emergence of in silico methods for predicting these properties. And today, in silico methods in predictive models derived from web tools and the rest actively facilitate the efficient evaluation of new drugs. We have well-trained digital models that can then predict properties of novel compounds and serve to accelerate drug discovery. With the incorporation of AI, they are doing just absolutely incredible things. I love using digital twins as an example. Digital twins are virtual representations of systems that enable advanced computational analysis of multiple variables, design choices, and options to aid in overall decision-making. They're widely used in a variety of industries and are becoming increasingly common in healthcare. For example, Boston Children's Hospital has a living heart project where they create a digital twin of a complex pediatric heart and allow surgeons to create, simulate, and test specific 3D models before they operate on a real patient. And that's improved outcomes in complex congenital heart defects. But these similar AI-enabled tools can facilitate in silico predictive models for drug discovery. Digital twins of organs and organ systems are actively being developed and being used, and they can, in theory, enable researchers to model diseases with very high accuracy. So a new product for diabetes may not need to be tested on a mouse model of diabetes, but perhaps on an AI-enabled human model of a human pancreas, sorry. Now, I think the potential for these models is going to be greatest in areas that are otherwise hard to study, and that includes pediatrics and rare diseases. Randomized controlled trials are the gold standard in effectiveness and safety clinical evaluations, but they also face a host of challenges. For children, approximately 1/3 of drugs are used off-label, and there is not timely access to high-quality data in children consistently. Since 1970s, there's been a series of regulatory actions over the last 55 years to improve this. Most recently, less than about a month ago now, the FDA was granted additional enforcement authority to issue fines for failure to complete mandatory pediatric studies. And I want to make clear, these decades of efforts have transformed informed pediatric therapeutics. And it's been, in 1970s, pediatrics were declared therapeutic orphans. We've come so far, but gaps remain. And there's a growing number of pediatric drug experts who believe that the adult standard may not be obtainable and are increasingly looking to pragmatic trial approaches as the best way forward. And I offer that AI presents a potential solution to pediatric drug discovery, as well as post-approval phase 4 monitoring. Through integration of data sources and improved extrapolations from real-world data, including adult data, animal model data, a pediatric digital twin model could actually address some of the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic differences between children and adults and help close some of these research gaps. So I hope you can see why I think difficult to study populations could genuinely benefit from AI-supported drug discovery the most. But I also want to take a second to explain why these difficult to study populations are also at a particularly high risk of legal and ethical violations. And I think it underscores the need for a broader population-specific as well as model-specific guidance. So AI is moving us to a world where data is the currency of the realm. These models are powerful because they integrate and draw conclusions from a truly staggering amount of data to try to understand otherwise complex systems like, a pancreas. That said, you have to get the data first. Ethically obtaining the data becomes complicated, and we're having evolving international conversations around transparency, accountability, privacy, security, and fairness. But a lot of the ethical safeguards that we use for adults, like informed consent and de-identification, become incredibly more complicated when we apply this to pediatrics or rare diseases. So right now, most patient-specific data are in electronic health records controlled by hospitals, and patients give broad consent to use this data in research. And hospital companies and insurance companies are partnering with AI companies to use this data and create these models, and they're using de-identified data. But there's a real ethical question whether any patient is knowingly consenting to have their data contribute to commercial models. And for children, this is even more heightened because children don't consent for themselves. A parent or a guardian can provide surrogate consent for a child. But what happens when a child turns 18? Can a child withdraw their consent? From a practical perspective, there's no way you could unintegrate a single person's data. It would be technically impossible. But it raises a really interesting question. Should they have a right to have their data removed? A right to not be part of these models? And this goes in the opposite direction as well. If a digital twin is created for an individual and 10 years down the line, the company goes out of business, who owns that AI model? Does the person who contribute their data or depend on that model have a right to repair that model or a right to get that model and take ownership of it? So questions of consent, duration, and ownership are increasingly needing attention. And it's not the only issue for rare diseases or age-specific conditions. Regulators, clinicians, and AI developers need to meaningfully engage with the risk of re-identification when you integrate data from multiple data centers. Teenagers in particular present challenges. Teenagers are entitled to heightened confidentiality for parts of their medical record, including STD testing, pregnancy testing, things like that. And AI data sets are built on electronic health records, not always with attention to this, to that level of granularity, which means we could be actively compromising the protected rights of these teenagers through these models. I can leave you with a number of other additional ethical concerns, but I'm going to conclude by again commending the FDA for its incredible effort in starting to create these guidance for AI use in drug discovery. It's an incredibly difficult task. I agree that accountability, fairness, privacy, and security and transparency are the big pillars that we really need to be focused on. But if we would like to create an explicitly patient-settled model with due consideration for ethical challenges, I think we need to consider broader issues, including consent, duration, and heightened privacy standards for patient-specific models.
Thank you. Let's give everyone a. So I want to ask sort of like a high level question that all of you may have something to say about. So identifying the time that development of a drug takes, it depends on what your starting point is, what your end point is. But for years and years, the pharmaceutical industry has thrown around numbers like 14 years or 17 years or 20 years from the identification of a molecule all the way to approval. 20 years from now, what will those numbers look like? And we will record this and put it in a time capsule and check it.
I mean, I'm not a scientist. I have to assume it's going to get shorter with a lot of these tools. I mean, that's what everybody's talking about, and that's of course a wonderful thing for patients as well as for the industry. But I would defer to my scientific colleagues for more on that.
I think it's really hard to say right now. I hope that it speeds things up. How much? I don't know. I feel like the whole field is grappling right now with how do we measure the efficiency gains? And one thing I would say, and I do think is true, if we don't keep fueling the scientific research engine, we are not going to continue to realize those gains over time. So it's not something that's a one and done. And we do have to keep investing in, wet lab science and research to make sure we can keep the discoveries going. So I would love to know the answer to that, but I just can't even tell you the magnitude of efficiency we might gain at this point.
Vanessa?
Yeah, I think it will decrease. I think that the time hopefully will decrease. So that's kind of what I've heard generally. But again, I'm not a scientist, so hard to say. But I do think it will go down.
Anjali, you're sort of a scientist.
Sort of. Okay, I will say the same thing to you that I say to all my patients when they ask me to predict the future. I missed the day in medical school when they gave out crystal balls, so I apologize. Whatever I tell you, I can tell you will be wrong. That said, I think we already.
That's at 7 years.
Yeah, exactly.
7.3 to be exact.
7. My lucky number is 5. Maybe we'll go with that. But no, to be fair, I think we've seen a model actually. When we look at the COVID vaccine development and the way that those drugs were developed, we saw that when America puts all of its energy towards drug discovery, and you see this coordinated international effort, we can get drug discovery done and approved and launched in what? 2 years? A year?
As well as community and universal agreement.
Well, that one takes longer. But I do think we've seen that if we put enough resources into something, it does not necessarily have to take 20 years. But I agree that it does require that baseline scientific investments.
Okay, so
Can I just add one quick thing, which is I do think that the success of AI in shortening that time frame, I think really partly depends on the governance structures and frameworks that we put on it. Because I think if we make missteps in the governance area, I think it's going to set it back. So
well, let me talk about a part of that time frame that maybe Elaine, you feel more comfortable talking about, and that others may also have thoughts about. Once the application gets to FDA, now Commissioner McCary has made a couple of pretty bold statements since he took office. One about the speed of review of applications, saying that what used to take months or years could take weeks. And the second is they've established a new default of a one controlled clinical trial, one phase 3 controlled clinical trial for approval. I don't know how much that one has to do with AI. Certainly the first one has to do with AI. Can you just reflect on those two assertions and the relationship of AI to them?
So first of all, starting with the one clinical trial, I do want to point out that it's already true that a lot of drug approval decisions are based on one clinical trial plus confirmatory evidence.
About half, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not as big of a sea change as maybe it was billed to be. I also, how do I put this? I think the assertions about drug approval timeframe in press release is very different from the boots on the ground and what the reviewers are actually saying about that. So to quote Anjali, the devil's in the details.
Nicole?
I agree, the devil's in the details, and I think this concept of one pivotal trial is really going to be case dependent. And I think if we are depending on one clinical trial, we have some indication it will be potentially a much more rigorous clinical trial. And then in other cases, two will be still be the standard. So in terms of AI and drug review, we're hoping that we can work with the agency and then figure out how we can better streamline our submissions. And so the agency receives them already in a way that they can analyze more quickly in a more streamlined way. And we are in discussions as an industry on how to do that. And the agency is looking at different steps that can be streamlined. I think that will take time. And I do think the devil's in the details. And I'm not sure how much more of an efficiency gain we would get over what's typically a 10-month review.
Vanessa?
I guess I'd just weigh in and say that it might speed up maybe some of the processes, but if FDA has questions about safety or efficacy, and they're going to require, additional patient populations, or don't think that the evidence is strong enough for like a particular part of the product, or that the study that was conducted doesn't include all the essential, patients that it should be, and the study should be expanded, then that is not going to be sped up by AI, right? You're going to still have to go find those patients, which can be, done through AI. You can have AI help find clinical trial sites that might be more beneficial. But you're still going to have to enroll those patients, get them to go through the clinical trial, get the data, and then get it back to FDA. And I don't know that AI speeds up that portion of the process.
Angela?
All right. I feel like for the lawyers in the room, and especially the students in the room, I feel like we need to at least give you the very quick 101 biostats of what we're actually talking about here. So one clinical trial, you do the clinical trial, you get a result, and that normally turns on a level of significance of 0.05. So I'm going to wave my magic hand and give you the math here. That translates to about a 1 in 20 chance that the finding that you're finding is not real. So about if you look at 20, we have 20 people in the room, let's say one person, well, let me make that even simpler. 1 in 20 chance that what you're seeing is not due to the drug. And that's not that high, but it's also not that low. We two clinical trials, both showing the same thing, both at a 1 in 20 chance. You can be much more confident that what you're seeing, the benefit you're actually seeing, is due to the drug and not due to just random chance. I think Voltaire has a really famous quote of, the best medicine, the doctor entertains the patient while, nature does the hard work. So there is the potential for other factors contributing to the positive that you're seeing. By going to one clinical trial, as we've been moving towards, that raises really interesting and difficult, broader questions. I would ask you, as members of the public, people who will be taking drugs in the future, how confident are you going to have in the drugs that you're taking in the future? What are you willing to pay for those drugs, knowing there's one clinical trial? We're seeing increasing evidence in studies that patients are starting to have hesitations or may think twice about paying for drugs that are conditionally approved under the accelerated approval program. I think these are really interesting questions that we're going to have to tackle down the road, but it starts from having that understanding of what does this change really mean? And for me, sitting in my doctor's office, being handed a prescription, how do I understand what FDA approval means with these changes.
Well, let me bring this back to AI. And this question comes from a position of ignorance and sheer curiosity, and it might be a dead end. But, the classic notion of proving a drug proving that a drug has substantial evidence of efficacy under the Food and Drug Act required 2 phase 3 adequate, well-controlled trials, each with a p-value of 0.05 or less, right? And in addition to that, you had to predefine the endpoints. You weren't allowed to play around with the data afterwards. And come up with a association that you weren't pursuing. My question is all this still true? And should it still be true? So in other words, is data mining with the assistance of AI necessarily a bad thing? Can FDA using AI look at clinical trial data and draw key values out of it that couldn't be drawn out of it before AI? And I'm sorry if that's like an ill-informed question, but do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I think it is important to remember that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has not been changed by any of these announcements about use of AI, right? So the standard is the same for, you have to show safety and effectiveness of the drugs. It's just a question of how are you getting at that result? And is AI in an assistive role where it's cutting the time it takes or it's making it easier to understand the data that you're getting from these trials? That's obviously very different from saying that AI is changing the data in some way, which I don't think anybody is proposing. So the statute is the statute. And so when we think about how AI is changing things, I think it's very important to come back to first principles, which is, what has Congress said about what the approval standard is, and how do we make sure that that is being preserved and is reviewable by courts?
I totally agree with that. And going back to first principles, one thing I'll say is that the promise of AI is that we might understand disease better. We might be able to identify patients at a much more granular level than we can now, and that maybe our studies will be more efficient, and maybe we will be able to identify patients who might benefit from the drugs, and maybe the results from our clinical trials will be more convincing in that case. So I do think it can help in that way. And I know at our company, some of our scientists are working on something using AI, and they published a paper on it, but it's really looking at multiple sclerosis and looking at patients to see that instead of just observing clinical outcomes and the way we define MS now, they're taking a whole bunch of data, including like biomarkers from patients, lab values, clinical data that we have, under consent from our clinical trials. And they're looking at that using AI, and they're able to kind of redefine what the disease looks like. Now, if that happens, we may be able to identify patients who would benefit from the intervention of the treatment, and then patients that wouldn't benefit might not even be in the studies to begin with. So I do think AI holds promise to improve the way we actually discover and develop and show that drugs work. But it's not the statute that's changing. I think we still want to adhere to what Congress intended and the best practices for actually substantial evidence generation.
Do you think there'll be fewer failed phase 3 trials?
I hope so.
Yeah.
It's a crystal ball thing, but that's the
I
hope.
think that's very possible. Yeah.
Vanessa?
I think if you identify the right patients, and I think that's the big promise of AI, right, is if you're able to look at clinical records and you have software that pulls clinical records from more physicians to identify patients for the trials, that you'll identify patients who might benefit earlier. And then if they are part of the trial and the drug is tested in them, and then you have maybe less failed phase 3 trials. I mean, ultimately it's really hard to say, because I don't, if you could guess if a clinical trial was going to fail at the phase 3 level, you'd be a millionaire, but you just never know, I guess, if the drug is going to work. It's, you have the breakthrough promises in the breakthrough programs at FDA identifying very promising drugs, but still ultimately, you might not get or you need to get from a regulatory approval perspective.
Anjali?
I will add, AI is a tool. It's a tool, it's not a thing on its own. So you can use the tool to p-hack. That's what you're describing, of manipulating data to get the outcome that you want. And that's, I mean, if you get very good at understanding data and playing with, which I'm sure you've learned in your PhD program as well, that it's something that if you get good at understanding data, you can p-hack. But that's not necessarily the best use or the way AI will be used, because if, well, especially in a peer review system, I look very carefully at how studies are done to think, is this done well? Is this done well enough that it would change my clinical practice and that I would do something different? I would put my license on the line and my professional judgment on the line to do something different. And if AI is being used to p-hack, I think that would, yes, you may get more positive studies, but you have plenty of people who also know how to p-hack who are going to say, no, I don't buy that. So I think of AI as more of the tool rather than necessarily the thing.
So another question for all of you. If Congress were functional and passed laws, what is the one thing you would like to see statutory intervention in this new world of AI and its intersection with drug development?
A wish list.
Anybody else want to go first? I don't have to answer.
I guess data integrity would probably be the biggest thing, right? Because if you have issues with data integrity, that there's someone to hold accountable for that. And if you can't hold AI itself accountable, then who is going to be held accountable if the data doesn't have integrity?
So what does that mean with respect to a statute? Like what would a statute that helped guarantee data integrity look like in broad terms?
It would have to have something about governance and transparency and being able to review the underlying data, the algorithms, the information and inputs. I think they would go into it so that someone is able to detect, if the data doesn't have integrity and that the drug ultimately might, not benefit patients.
Other thoughts?
So I hesitate to say that this is the one way AI should be regulated, because AI use in different scenarios prompts different regulatory concerns. And it's very hard to draw like a single sledgehammer to solve all of this. But where I think there is a gap that Congress is particularly well suited to fill is to think through accountability. AI challenges a lot of the legal systems that we have as checks on drug safety and checks on drug use, whether it's tort law through medical malpractice or products liability, or whether it outside of the administrative law context. And I think there are areas as we think about federal versus state laws and how our historic division between regulation and tort law, because it's always a balance and we're always renegotiating that balance of where do we fall between regulation and tort law, on which side do we lean. With drugs we've leaned very strongly towards regulation. I think as we're rethinking the role of AI, rethinking that balance would be particularly beneficial. And I think that's something that doesn't necessarily can percolate through Congress with relation to preemption laws and what should or should not be preempted, and how do we hold AI accountable and where should that accountability lie. Various other legal scholars have proposed things like enterprise liability between the AI company, the pharmaceutical company, the drug, the hospital and the physician, but exactly how do we structure liability, I think, is being challenged in a way that Congress can weigh in.
Elaine, do you think, like, there was a big statute called 21st Century Cures in, what was it, 2016? Mm-hmm. And when I saw that statute, I was thinking there's almost nothing in here that FDA couldn't have done before they passed the statute. Do you think that FDA has sufficient flexibility after having been at the agency for all these years, sufficient flexibility under the current statutory structure to handle all of these new problems going forward? Or do you think that the statute will have to be amended in some way or another?
I actually think that the legal framework of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is what is needed. I don't think there needs to be a grand overhaul. Tweaks maybe, but I think that the statute really makes it incumbent upon the agency to be able to explain what it's doing, right? And of course, this isn't just the statute, it's also the principles of administrative law. As long as the agency can stand by what it's doing and explain what it's doing, even if that includes AI, as long as they can explain how the AI contributed to the result and how it makes scientific sense, I feel like the framework is sufficient. I don't think that AI changes any of that. It just is a matter of, I think, how the agency works to explain its decisions is going to have to become a little bit more robust and maybe a little bit more complicated. And reviewers are going to need to have the tools to not just use the AI, but explain it. But I think the framework is there.
Anjali, what do you think of that problem?
I mean, from an administrative law standpoint, I see a lot of potential there. That I agree with you that we do have really robust structures in place. But my big concern is that needs resources. You need to, in order to have adequately explained your reasoning, in order to even understand the reasoning that's submitted from pharmaceutical companies, I think that requires extra resources. Because I feel like you are suggesting almost a human in the loop here, that the human in the loop will review both how the FDA is using AI, but also how information coming from drug companies that relies on AI to the FDA will be reviewed by the FDA as a human and then be explained. And I like that as a principle, but I worry that we're asking a lot from the FDA, and I feel like that is where we're going. I believe that you're right. That is where we're going. You need another body of staff and really well-trained people to do that effectively.
Although the agency is already required to explain itself. So, yes. I mean, every single regulatory decision has a very comprehensive memo explaining, the science, the legal implication, all of the rationale behind it. That's already, and it is very resource intensive.
Yes, they're very well written. If you've never read them, they're very, really, really complex and very well done.
So I think that, that's already true. It just, now if AI is used in that process, that needs to be one of the things that's explained.
Oh, I guess I was thinking of AI will increase the number of reviews the FDA needs to do in a given time period, and therefore may raise resource constraints.
I'm not sure that it will. I mean, I think that's a question.
Fair enough.
So any questions from the audience? Oh, lots of questions.
Hands up again so you can pass the mic.
Well, I think students.
Okay.
So unfortunately, my question does have to do with that human in the loop framework. Just thinking about autonomous and or agentic AI, I was curious what the goal of the industry is right now, and developers and agencies relating to like the human's direct involvement in using AI. Like, in other words, is the goal to maintain a human in the loop type framework, and what does that look like? Would the AI act as a researcher or a reviewer, or would the human act as the researcher or reviewer and the AI act as the thing doing the actual task? So that's my question.
This is the question that all my students have, no matter what their ambitions are the robot overlords going to take my job? Thoughts?
I mean, at FDA, at least, human in the loop is still absolutely the expectation. I mean, they say every single announcement they make about AI, they say human in the loop. I mean, it's a very, now, will that change? I don't know. But as of right now, that is absolutely the expectation and needs to be. So industry, I don't know.
I think a lot about what you're just talking about and what would we want, and we want to preserve the integrity of regulatory decision making. I think we would love to see principles coming from regulatory bodies that actually confirm that there will be a human in the loop and that their review of our applications preserves the narrative that we set forward in our application. So I think that's really important. Within companies too, there's a human in the loop, especially now. We're really in the early days and we're just learning how to trust AI and how to think about what evidence is required to make sure that we have our applications, buttoned up. I think we could think to a future where maybe we want to take a risk-based approach, and that's what everyone is doing. Are there things that maybe require less human supervision? And I do wonder in certain regions of the world where regulators are doing what's called reliance, where they're essentially approving drugs based on what other health authorities have decided previously. And they have huge backlogs because they don't have near the resources that we do in the US or maybe the EU. I do think that maybe more activities would be subject to automation versus a new molecule first time at a regulator. But that's just speculation.
Any other thoughts?
I mean, I guess, in terms of the human in the loop, I could just think about applications of AI, not in the drug development context, but just like in my regular day-to-day job. And it's great, like the demos are great, but at the end of the day, if the demo was not trained on data that it needs to have been trained on, then the output is not going to be what it needs to be. So you do have to have a human in the loop, because I'm just thinking, like, let's say diligence questions, right? If the AI has been trained on diligence questions to ask a pharmaceutical company about their use of AI, but the training data omitted like a certain subset of questions that should be asked, then we won't get a full response from the company about all of the risks about AI and drug development, for example. And so then you have this key piece of data that it might be a material risk that's completely missing from the analysis. So I think from that perspective, you do need a human in the loop. It's not really directly on point, but that's just how I see it.
All right, I will be the science fiction person here. I'm thinking about this kind of from a clinical perspective, also from a global perspective. As I was reading about what new exciting things are coming out with AI in medicine, one of the things that caught my eye was a model of looking at EKGs globally, where, especially in areas where you may not have an expert who's able to do more additional cardiac studies, what can you diagnose or glean from an EKG? And it's your watch can do an EKG these days. It's not perfect, but like an EKG is generally readily accessible. And in that scenario, the AI model is reading and creating an idea that others may rely on, may question. But what if, and again, hypothetical world, what if we had an exceptionally well-designed model? What if we vetted it? What if we re-vetted it? What if we trained it on additional data? What if we ran it 10 times to find all the flaws and then reran it again 10 times on different data? If we had such a perfect model, is there a possibility that it will be better than what a human can do? And I'm thinking about this as a clinician, like we are humans, we make mistakes. Is it possible to misread an EKG or miss something on an EKG? Absolutely. If we get this AI model that we've put all the data in, vetted it, and done a million different things so that it is consistently better than the average clinician, does adding a human in the loop make the AI model better, or does it make it worse? Are we more likely to introduce error, or are we more likely to improve it? I think where we are now is there's real value, especially in the regulatory space, and to have a human in the loop. We're not at the point where we have this like hypothetical ideal model that can consistently do better than the average human. But I think there's also really interesting questions of, if we get such a model, how do we use it ethically, and what is the ideal outcome? I think FDA poses, from a regulator's perspective, it poses additional questions because it's not always the same data. You're not looking for an expected set of outcomes or diseases. So perhaps there is no possibility of creating that ideal model, but it raises an interesting ethical question.
I think one of the things that scares me about the whole human in the loop question is it's one thing to make a mistake or have the model make a mistake, but it's another thing to hallucinate and make things up. So, for example, the first draft of the MAHA report, you might recall, was full of hallucinated studies, non-existent. This is being recorded, right? Should be here. So again, it's one thing to make a mistake, but if you're making up results and saying that they're factual, that's something that I don't think most humans do. So until we can get AI to calm down and stop doing that, that makes me really nervous.
So another question? Yes.
I enjoy every second of this presentation. I think that it's not, I work with the data, I work at FDA, implemented safety data mining and way back in 2002. But it's not the model only.
Put the mic a little closer.
It's not the model only. It's the data that is very messy. It's not interoperable. Then, we have multiple variations of female. Then we transform into one model and then into another and a third, and we lose contact with the details of the original data. Why we cannot take data from 20 years ago? Laboratory data is objective, but it's messy also. Then we cannot predict the future of the patient. Thank you. I enjoy everything.
I will just second what you said. Data is inherently messy and can be very complicated to work with and require really thoughtful judgment in making sure we get the right outcome. So I think what you're saying is incredibly important, especially for law students to hear. So thank you.
Can we go a little bit over?
Yes.
So 2 questions over here, Joseph in the back, and then this gentleman in the front.
I was thinking about how worried are you all, if at all, about regulation's ability to keep pace with how quickly AI modeling adapts? If that makes sense. Like, I feel like every time I hear presentations about the integration of AI into pharmaceuticals, I'm constantly blown away. And I was curious how you all feel about the rate of regulating. How does regulating work with this modeling that doesn't feel static and is constantly changing?
I mean, as I was saying before, I think the regulatory structure is really sound and should be able to adapt to AI. Again, coming back to the first principles about having to explain your rationale for regulatory decision making. I do want to just comment that to the extent that regulations do need to change, and I'm talking regulations, not statute, which of course are very different. Regulations are extremely cumbersome to enact. And one thing that was very frustrating working at FDA was how long it takes to issue a regulation. Statutes can be faster if you have a functional Congress. So I do think that, to the extent that we can operate under the regulatory structure that we have right now, I think that's going to be really important because it cannot move that quickly. So I think, we need to be careful with our governance structures, and the kinds of questions that we're raising here today really need to be grappled with by policymakers so that we can have them fit within the regulatory structure that we have.
And if I could just editorialize for a moment, the 10-to-1 rule that the Trump administration has embraced covers guidances. And the notion that guidances are burdensome regulation rather than in many instances the path forward for both regulators and industry is just silly in my mind. So
they don't have the force and effect of law. But.
Yes.
For the students who have not taken administrative law in the room, guidance rules that go through the informal rulemaking process take approximately 8 to 10 years on average. So we're dealing with very long timelines. Guidances can be issued, but the FDA has historically taken a very thoughtful approach, including having a comment period and incorporating the comments, all of which takes time. And I will say, and I said this in my remarks, so I'll reiterate this, the FDA's approach to AI guidance tries to provide clarity, but also maintains flexibility. And that is very, and especially with a changing environment, that's very difficult to do. And it's really a model of how to try and how to do that well. So there's some real utility there, but it is a challenge.
I'm not sure I really have a question, but that's your observations on it. It seems possible that the greatest impact of AI will be on the customer of drugs, because it enormously increases their knowledge and ability to manage the situation. When I'm now getting ready to look at the drugs, I can know everything about those drugs before I leave the bathroom. It may take a while with AI, but AI as a personal colleague is very empowering. And I can't help but think that huge pressure from much more knowledgeable consumers, and typically more knowledgeable than the doctors prescribing, because the AI knows all that, right? Every drug interaction ever mentioned. So I'm wondering, what do you think that's going to make any difference to this?
Well, interestingly, the FDA recently asserted that it thinks that there could be a wave of OTC switches that is prescription to over-the-counter status. And I don't know whether they linked that to patient-focused AI, but it could be part of the thought process. Anything else?
I mean, I think it's a great comment. I think it is empowering, right? It's just a matter of making sure that the data that you're getting as a consumer is accurate, and it's truthful and not misleading. And I think that's always an issue that, FDA regulates, the Federal Trade Commission regulates. So, it's great for consumers, but it also has to be, accurate, right? And so you're not misled as to what might cure a particular disease, as we saw with COVID. Right, a number of people wanted to get prescriptions for ivermectin, thinking that it could cure COVID, and might have had damaging impacts as a result of those prescriptions.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I will throw out what I was saying with accountability and the tort regulation divide speaks to what you're saying. The learned intermediary doctrine, which many of you may remember from tort law, dust off some of those cobwebs, is premised on the idea that these drugs are inherently complex and that they cannot be understood by an average consumer. You're throwing out a concept of what if the drugs could be understood by an average consumer? How would that shift? And to me, using your hypothetical, I think a shift that we may see is in how do we allocate responsibility for, what do we expect a consumer to know? What do we expect the physician to communicate? And it's It's a really interesting question. And I think there's growing numbers of studies that try to look at consumer perspectives that to capture exactly what you're thinking about.
So thank you, everyone. Some applause.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I want to thank Professor Scelzo and Tamina for just being such a lifeline and always helping. I want to thank Tiana. You've been great leadership and could not have done it without you. Thank you, Professor Grossman, for moderating this panel. He agreed to do it before he even met me. So that was awesome. Thank you, panelists, for coming. It was an honor to be here with you guys. And thank you for everyone watching online and in person. Please join us for this reception outside with food and mingling. So thank you, everyone.